we'd like to welcome you to the Literacy Volunteers of Harrison County YouTube channel. We would like to thank you for joining us. We're a non-profit United Way agency. Today we're going to have 2 lessons on the brain. My brother, Dr. Richard Suplita, is going to do those lessons for you. We're going to break it in half, and so he's getting ready to begin, and I will be helping him today. So thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much for joining today. I was a professor in neuroscience at the University of Georgia for about 12 years. And so this material is something that I've been through a number of times, although it's been several years since I've revisited it. So I want to talk today about the central nervous system, or what is known simply as the CNS. And the central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. So if we're talking about nerves in the body, it's everything that's encased in bone. Of course, the brain is encased within the cranial bones, and the spinal cord is encased within the spinal column or the vertebral column. So I want to take a bottom-up approach. And so we're going to start here at the bottom. We're going to talk first about the spinal cord, and then move up and talk about what is called the hind brain. And then we'll move up a little more and talk about the midbrain, and finally we'll talk about the forebrain, and I believe the forebrain is going to be the second part of this lesson. So the best way to describe this functionally would be as a hierarchy of function. And what that means simply is that each level you go up, things get more complicated, they get more sophisticated. You have much more regulation as you work your way from the spinal cord up through the hindbrain and then ultimately to the forebrain. So starting here with the spinal cord, or simply the spine, what the spine does is it directs sensory signals from the body into the central nervous system, and then many of those signals get relayed on up to the brain. We call this the afferent function. It carries information from the body, from the periphery, into the central nervous system. And also the spinal cord sends motor signals out from the central nervous system. So these would be efferent functions of the spinal cord. And the way this works, I represented down here a cross-section, a slice through, a horizontal slice through the spinal cord. And what you see in the middle is sort of a butterfly shape. Now, in the intact animal, that would be all gray matter inside of the butterfly, and then surrounding the butterfly shape would all be white matter. And so the way this is organized is you have the dorsal part of the spinal cord, the part towards the back. I always think of a dorsal fin on like a dolphin to help you remember a dorsal. Then you have the ventral aspect, which is the belly side. A way to remember that is ventriloquist. It comes from the same Latin word. Literally a ventriloquist, a person who has the puppet, but you can't see their mouth move, is a belly talker. Okay, so that helps us remember dorsal and ventral. And the way this is arranged is the dorsal horn, the dorsal part of the spinal cord, is responsible for bringing information, sensory signals, for example, pain signals, right, or touch signals, in from the body into the spinal cord. And then conversely, the ventral spinal cord is going to be involved with sending motor signals out from the spinal cord to the body. So we have 31 sets of spinal nerves, 8 cervical, those are the ones up in the neck region, and for example, they help us move our hands and that sort of thing. We have the 12 thoracic, sort of the middle part, 5 lumbar, which is the small of the back area, and that's going to bring signals in, for example, and send signals to the legs and feet, and then 5 sacral, and finally 1 coccygeal. Now, I want to give you one example of just a basic function of the spinal cord you're probably familiar with. If you've been to a doctor, and the doctor has you put your knee over the edge of the table, and then she'll take the little rubber mallet and whack you just below your kneecap, and you have that knee-jerk reflex, right? That's what they're looking for. That is a simple example of a spinal reflex arc. The sensory signal from the mallet comes into your spinal cord, and then immediately a motor signal is sent out that causes you to kick your leg out. Okay, so we'll go ahead and turn the page here. So moving on up to the next level, we have the hindbrain. Now the fancy scientific word for this is rhombencephalon. If you're preparing perhaps for a nursing exam or something like that, you may need to know that term. But the hindbrain is made up of three predominant structures. It's made up of the medulla, or sometimes it's called the medulla oblongata. That's denoted here in 1. Number 2 is the pons. That's an easy one to remember. The Latin word there just means bridge. And then finally 3, behind the pons and the medulla, you have something called the cerebellum, denoted in number 3. Now the medulla and pons work together as one functional unit, and the primary role of the medulla and pons is to regulate what we call vital functions or basic vegetative functions, things like heart rate and blood pressure and respiration. And so logically, if you think about it, if you damage your hindbrain, or if you take a drug that very powerfully suppresses the activity of the hindbrain, something like narcotics, heroin for example, or any sort of synthetic narcotics, can be lethal at relatively low doses because it suppresses the brain activity here in the hindbrain. Now, if we look at the cerebellum, it does something very different. The cerebellum, the word means little brain. It's fascinating. About 70% of all of the neurons for the brain and spinal cord, for all of the CNS, is found within the cerebellum. So it's very densely packed with neurons. The cerebellum plays an important role in balance, in coordination, timing, rhythm, and also more recently it's been discovered that it plays a very critical role in our ability to shift attention. So for example, new research areas looking at the role of the cerebellum in things like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, and even conditions like the autism spectrum, Asperger's, involve different types of functioning of the cerebellum. And so in terms of the effects of drugs like ethanol, which is just the kind of alcohol you drink in beer and wine and whiskey, drugs like narcotics again, or drugs like THC, that's the main psychoactive constituent of marijuana, all suppress activity in the cerebellum, and consequently they throw off our sense of balance and coordination and timing, and they also disrupt our attention. Okay, we'll go ahead and turn here. All right, so moving on up to the midbrain. This is known as the mesencephalon, from Latin. And the midbrain is going to be very important for coordinating sensory reflexes. And so I think of the sense of audition, our sense of hearing. Two major structures here are the inferior colliculus and the superior colliculus. Colliculus is just a Latin term for little hill. So these are midbrain structures. In terms of our auditory, our hearing reflexes, the inferior colliculus plays a vital role in our startle reflex. If you've ever been outside and all of a sudden you hear a car backfire or you hear a crash, some very sudden onset loud noise, reflexively you'll orient towards wherever the sound is coming from. This is because even before the hearing signals get to your conscious brain, they reach the inferior colliculus, and just like the knee-jerk reflex, it automatically turns your body in that position. In terms of vision, something very similar happens. Projections from your eye to the superior colliculus of the midbrain, and this is important for things like peripheral vision. Perhaps you're walking down the sidewalk and just kind of maybe texting, just kind of minding your own business, and all of a sudden, let's say a large dog or something would run by in your periphery unexpectedly. You would tend to orient, that would catch your attention. You would shift your eyes in that direction because of these connections to the superior colliculus. And if you notice, we can get through much of our life on autopilot, even driving, right? Walking and texting, driving, having a conversation. Really our attention is somewhere else, but it's these midbrain structures that are largely keeping us from running off the road or walking into the street. And so I call this sort of the autopilot function of the visual centers of the midbrain. And finally, I want to mention that the midbrain is very important as a source of dopamine, one of the most important neurotransmitters. We talk about it extensively in terms of things like drug addiction. But the dopamine system, it's just abbreviated DA, is extremely important. It's critical for movement, for translating the thought of I want to move my body in a certain way. into the ability to actually execute that motor behavior requires dopamine. And so there's a structure here called the substantia nigra, literally the black body or the black area of the midbrain, and it's going to be the brain's most important source of the neurotransmitter dopamine. And so what you see in Parkinson's disease, for example, is a large-scale death of these dopaminergic, these dopamine-producing cells of the midbrain. We lose them as we age. People who go on to develop Parkinson's disease lose those at an accelerated rate. Let's see, and so I think we're getting into there's 2 pages stuck together here. Yeah, so we'll go ahead and take a quick break here, and then part 2 we'll focus on the forebrain.